I remember as a child, my parents would take us to church, and I was very perplexed by a certain thing I was told, and this had to do with God's creation of the universe. And I naturally thought, even as a child, if God created the universe, this world, then who created God? And I was informed that God is not created. God created himself. And I just couldn't picture it. I couldn't see how that was possible. But even as a small child, I felt like I was groping for some solution, and what I came up with at the time was that I imagined God first was a hand that existed in the sky, and then it took its hand and pulled himself out of the clouds. I think it's important to distinguish between the concept of God and religion, because the two are not the same. That there, of course, can be various types of religions or life philosophies that don't have a Godhead, but they are put into place for very practical and psychological reasons, whether it be having some meaning in life or structure or ritual or order to social and interpersonal relations, and they may come from an entire historical tradition that a culture has adopted throughout the centuries, such as Buddhism or Jainism, Hinduism. However, I think most people, when we're speaking about God, that we're really appealing to the pedestrian notion of what that means, and that usually the term itself is a signifier. God is a semiotic that usually evokes the notion of a supreme being that is the creator and cause of the universe. And then you have various types of other omni-attributes and omni-properties that are often subscribed to God in the Abrahamic monotheisms, which even complicate the notion or problematize the notion even more. But if we simply say that God is the supreme agent, which that is also a personal being that brought the existence of the universe and sustains the existence of the universe, that's what I believe most people, when they believe in a monotheistic faith, would subscribe to that. Now, I find that is untenable. I also find it to be illogical and not rational on many different planes, regardless of a person's desire for God or need for God. However, the notion of God can be an entirely personalized and relativized experience, purely a subjective internal relation to whatever they construct that Godhead to be. So in some sense, this might be more of a mystical union with the natural world or with other human beings, and you may have much more of a philosophically justified definition or operationalized definition of God. But however, whatever you say, if you take away the notion of agency and a sense of personal dimension to this so-called supreme being, then that's really not God to me. I mean, that would be much more metaphysics, much more of a sense, or perhaps even a sense of mysticism. So I think it's very important when we have any dialogue or discussion about what constitutes God, that people have a working knowledge of understanding what they mean by that. Whatever the internalized emotional experience or intuition of what they would call God to be is really the deposit of psychological processes, and often they are benign, and often they're well intentioned, and even moral in nature. However, we can't lose sight of the fact that they are emanating from our own mind. We are relating to a certain self-ideal when we posit God, and so when people have their own internalized emotional or spiritual or aesthetic types of organizations, then they are using an inferential leap to a metaphysical factor that is unwarranted, in my opinion. But it doesn't mean that it invalidates the phenomenology of their lived experience. And ultimately, I think that's what we're all looking for when we are looking for spirituality. That we're looking for animating our beautiful soul, what is the best of us, what we hope, what we wish, what we want, what we desire more than anything. And that is some type of felt relation to ideality. And here God becomes a certain semiotic that allows for this to persist in our own psychic faculties. On the face of things, I could find no legitimate, tangible, or justification for any of the traditional arguments that are in theology or philosophy of religion to grant any substance whatsoever to the belief in a supreme being. And the supreme being, as we know it, is more in the sense of the monotheistic tradition of a supra-personal and supernatural creator of the universe, who has a divine presence, who animates the cosmos and sustains existence as we know it. And this is at least one qualification of a belief in a pedestrian notion, common notion of God. I believe that all those arguments fail. They're based upon emotional prejudices. They're based upon the need for constructing various philosophical and logical and rational paradigms that will attempt to justify the belief in a divine object. But as in the history of metaphysics and Western theology, that we have not really found any satisfactory answers other than those that are satisfactory to the believer. If we start from the standpoint of the evidential argument, we are really relying upon science and reason to be our guide. And this is why naturalized psychology has something to offer to the argument that ultimately the belief in God is based upon an argument from desire, and it is based upon our own emotional and psychic needs to have a divinity principle. However, when we look at some of the traditional philosophical arguments, the most glaring is, where's the evidence for God's existence? It's incumbent upon any believer or anyone who speculates a divine ontological object to provide us with some proof. So to echo the notion of New Atheism that the absence of evidence is evidence of absence, I feel that this is something that we must simply take as a psychic fact, not that the notion is that there is no evidence that presents itself to us to justify the belief in a divine being. Why is that so? Well, God has failed to manifest. God has failed to appear. And just as we would demand of anyone to provide us with some rationale, we would want to see that it's been demonstrated, that there is some type of tangibility, and that usually is an appeal to the empirical world. So from the standpoint of empiricism, I believe that we can easily say that science has already disproven the existence of God by virtue of the fact that God is not manifest. And so, in order for anything to exist, it must appear or manifest in order for it to be actual. Now, of course, we have many different types of, quite ingenious at times, arguments that want to salvage God from the bog of illegitimacy. So, for instance, the reality of divine hiddenness. We appeal to the existence of God that is hidden, and that God has reasons for doing this. Well, again, that presupposes that that something divine exists to begin with, and that God would be, in a covert place in the universe. Let alone that we presuppose there would be various psychological reasons for God to not appear. The bottom line is that nothing is here. Nothing presents itself to us. And that is often a very difficult thing for people to experience, because it's tantamount to a loss. It's tantamount to mourning the loss of the fulfillment of a wish. And then people have to accept that. So much of humanity cannot buy into the thought that there is nothing more than this. And the anxiety and the dread and the trepidation and the psychic pain associated with having to live life on its own terms without any kind of possible future salvation is very depressing. And hence we as humanity construct very sophisticated arguments to allow for at least the possibility of a divine being. But the fact is that existence is not a predicate. You cannot just think something into being. You cannot logically try to maneuver yourself through some decorous way of theoretical or mathematical formulas or logical proofs. You cannot define God into being. And so any type of inferential approach is simply going to be relegated to the realm of ideas. And it's not going to bring us any closer to a pure experiential, empirical appreciation of the presence of God. If God didn't exist, we'd have to invent him. And that's exactly what we've done as humanity. We've invented a divine object for the belief that there must be a supreme being and supernatural creative force that brought the existence of the universe into being. When this is simply the deposit of human desire. It is simply based upon our wishful fantasy principle that there will be a provenance in which all of our desires and wishes will become fulfilled in the possibility of a future world that also settles the score about the suffering that we have incurred during our own lifetime. And this is a fantasy that is not going to go away. I'm convinced of it. Because we have such a strong need for God. Regardless of the fact that there may be rational and logical justifications for warranted beliefs that either can be verified or falsified, and regardless of whether or not our own personal psychologies have anything to do with that argument or that evidence, that we cannot escape the fact that we're psychological beings and that we experience and perceive the world and desire for certain types of experiences to be true. So on one hand, if a person is trying to claim that just because I have the need to believe or the desire for God, that doesn't mean in and of itself it's not true. That meaning that God doesn't exist. I would still want to point out that there's certain correlations between your desire or need as well and the very object that you're presupposing. So, for instance, in any traditional discourse on God, you're entering into a discussion of the very thing that you have the burden of proving. So, why should I accept your premises? Why should I assume the very thing that you predicate is the case? So, if anything, the burden of proof would be on the theist, the person who predicates God's existence. And I would just ask the other question: why should I assume the very thing that you have the burden to set out to prove? Why should I accept your argument, which is simply a circular one, of begging the question of the very thing that you're asking me to accept at face value? So I feel that psychologically it gives much more of a richer explanation of why humanity as a whole has this internalized felt need to believe. God does not exist and cannot exist. Moreover, cannot exist as anything but an idea. And the idea is born of a fantasy principle. Hence, it's born of a deep-seated desire and need for what God truly signifies to the human psyche. And that is ultimately a sense of ideality. And that we project this abstract notion of ideality into concrete and tangible experiences and properties. However, it's truly, though, based upon, at least my opinion here, is that we can't give up on God because humanity has a deep need for God. And the reasons behind this are multiple, but one of which is that I believe that humanity has this need tenaciously to cling on to the notion of divinity, and particularly a certain type of afterlife, rather than mourning the notion of a natural absence for this delusion of divine presence. And the resistance, the felt resistance of giving up on that divinity principle is tantamount to a psychic loss. And hence people's defenses are such as that they have to preserve the notion or the need to have that felt relation to ideality that takes the shape of of a traditional definition of God. And why is this so? It's because that we lack. Because that we are being in relation to lack, and we have to accept that, and the mind has to mourn it as this natural absence. However, it is defensively fraught with the need to believe, the will to believe, the desire for the attainment of various cherished goals and wishes, and as we would like them to be fulfilled. Whether from the sacred to the secular, we, I believe, have an inner pining, an inner drive or desire for this spiritual realm, and we often view it in a sense of I prefer the term ideality. That there is a certain realm of ideals or our own felt relation and lived relation to value that we, in many ways, worship. At the very least, we are in dire need of it and pursue it because we feel that something in us is lacking. And we have the desire to fulfill the lack. And yet we also have certain fantasies that life as we know it could be better. And yet pursuing these experiences, whether you call them the numinous, the transcendent, whether you call them spiritual, they often have a heightened emotional quality that's attached to this type of quest. That often there's I believe, whether in belief or whether in the absence of belief, the quality of the lived experience, the phenomenology of the interior is what we assign spiritual value to. And often you can see when people are seeking out the divine in this sense, which that they're looking for that higher quality of the inner lived experience. And this can take many forms. It could take very naturalized forms, whether that be, a certain communion or value in nature, whether it can be in the quality of our own lives and relationships we make with other people, whether it be in aesthetic types of pursuits, and whether it be as an ethical comportment of our better half. I feel that one can lead a spiritual life without having the belief in a divine being whatsoever. And this, I believe, echoes much of what secular humanism has to offer today. We call this trying to be a good person, trying to live a moral life, trying to live a virtuous life like the ancients would have us aspire toward. And that is ultimately an ethical relation to self, other, and the world. And we can certainly teach this in very institutionalized ways, such as how do we develop empathy and compassion for other people? Well, we often need help with that early in life, whether that be in our home with our parents or other extended family or other community groups, or in school, that we are constantly being taught how to be more attuned to others, and how that is also an ethical relation to ourselves. And regardless of what canon of doctrines, of beliefs that might be part of in terms of more organized religions, it is simply a reflection of human excellence. Life is a process of becoming, and it's both a creative discovery of our found given world and our psychological ideals that we aspire toward. And this is what helps us become better people. The quality of the lived experience is often what we're talking about when we're searching for, spiritual experiences. And one has to bracket or set aside or suspend the ontological questions of whether or not, there is a Godhead that structures the universe, that exists independent of our minds, that exists in this metaphysical realism, and I think that if people need to have that, then they haven't fully analyzed themselves, that they haven't really fully looked at what's really motivating that need. But regardless of what's motivating the need, which is always a defense, it's always based in a certain psychological transference or a compromise formation or a certain need for a self-object experience, or a need for a divine attachment figure, whatever kind of driving force is underneath that the other aspects of our psyche is always seeking out those more pristine and personally meaningful, subjective aspects of living. And I would say that pursuing your own personal spiritual path is ultimately a subjective enterprise. And it's all ultimately about improving the quality of your living. And that, in many ways, is a human endeavor. It's embracing the beauty of people, of those who we value and love, the notion of an ideal in the sense that what is virtuous, what is true, what is ultimately of value in the universe, and whether this takes on natural forms of beauty or aesthetic sensibilities or the pursuit of the numinous. Ultimately, I think people are seeking that. So on one hand, those who need to have the ontological foundation in order to sustain their belief haven't really mourned the reality of the lack of divine presence. And ultimately, I believe this is because of their own fear of dying and fear of facing our own mortality. And this is why living in the moment, cultivating the most of your own personal experiences, generating a sense of happiness in your life, and developing deep, loving, personal, meaningful relationships with other people is ultimately what breaks bread.